All right, everyone. Welcome, welcome.
You just plug one of the other ones in and move over there.
Yeah.
But it's always, I can do that to other people too. And when I know, it's like easier.
You have to get your own right. I know I don't.
I can do that to other people too. And when I know, it's like easier.
Okay, that's get that like talking into this and then you hear the feedback.
So how would you hear the students?
All right, so we're gonna get started here in just a minute.
Why is it so loading? Yeah, I closed it out. Russell, why are you so slow?
I mean, I see the page.
It's going.
Okay, so I guess we'll start out with kind of how we did yesterday. So we'll go around the room, maybe say one thing you're happy with so far, and another thing that you're struggling with, and if we need to nip it in the butt right away, we'll do that. So maybe we'll start. Takir, you're up.
All right. I like that I was able to understand callback functions, which helped me understand the math and for each.
Mhm.
That was good. I struggled yesterday with keeping up with you. So I'm happy they asked you to do a little saving off snippets of your code.
Oh, yes. Yep. I think that's been very helpful for many people. So whoever suggested that, I'm glad they did.
Yeah, I'm gonna second that. I like this.
For me, yeah,
Yeah.
that's sense too. I like JavaScript because I don't have to make it. Just do it. And for the most part, I'm following along pretty well, but my struggle is just, it's so big. And the nice thing about HTML and CSS is you can see it. You had your project and you could see where you were going, where it looked like. But in JavaScript, there's all these pieces that I don't yet understand how they fit together, which is kind of a variation on the theme of, it's hard to recall them and remember them. I get that we don't need to remember them, but I don't always know how to apply them in all the ways they can be applied.
Right. It's not as visual. Right. Yeah.
So yeah, I was saying that the other day. That's right. But it's okay. Like I'm following along, and I get every step. If I knew that was exactly what I was doing, I would just go back and watch the video or access the snippet.
Mhm.
I just need a lot of practice, basically.
Right. Yeah. Languages like this aren't typically the way we think. It's different, right? They're abstractions rather than things you see in your head or emotions you feel. Right. These are just well, what does this represent? Right. It could be it's kind of esoteric in that sense.
Right.
Yep.
So it takes a while.
It's getting used to it. Yeah.
Okay, so what I like so far, I think, I'm following along pretty well. And the for each and the math was good yesterday. But if I'm also understanding the whole advanced scratch that you were showing us on the console at the bottom, that'll allow, I'm thinking anyway, allow me to see what I kind of put up there and change things, see if I like it, and then actually implement it in my actual code to stay there.
Right.
My biggest thing is just trying to get it all to work and run. I just need to figure out a good way to practice each point. And, oh, okay, good, got that down. And move on to the next one.
We're going to talk a little bit about that sort of thinking today. I'm glad you made that point.
Oh, it's my turn. Cool.
Your turn.
What I liked was going through all the functions, like the way that you did, like so like setting each one up, like just literal practice, like that was really helpful. And I think okay, I just need to practice. And I'm not sure with anything in particular at this point.
Practice.
Yeah.
Kelly.
So things I liked. I like this tiny FDF project. I think that's really an interesting way to demonstrate what you're trying to teach us this week. So I'm looking forward to sitting down and coding that out to see how it all gets put together. So it's pretty cool. My problems, I am a little upset with myself that I wasn't able to figure out the table that you had in the homework last night, like how to do that. Like I sent in something, but it's wrong. It's wrong. And I'm having a little bit of an issue with like making my code more abstract. You know, like I can write a list of things and have it do one specific thing, but I'm having trouble writing reusable functions that, you know, I can plug stuff into. So that's just something I need to work
This
on.
project's gonna do that.
Awesome.
So far, we're like, yeah, everything's lining up. We knock all the pins down.
Like yesterday, I'm with you 100% on the stuff that we did yesterday. And I went home last night and I kind of was like, okay, well, what we did yesterday, I can see doing this. So now I'm just kind of like waiting to see it all come together, really.
Cool. Very cool. All right. Cool. I like to hear that. What's maybe one thing you're struggling with?
Pardon?
Oh, sorry. Tim. Okay. Very good. Elizabeth.
Doing I was getting still in class right away. Go to helpful. Get away for a second.
Yes.
I didn't submit the wrong answer. I didn't get it even close. No, look for my wrong.
Oh, well, you know, no one gets everything right. It's fine. So one thing you're really liking so far and one thing you're still struggling with.
I'm just waiting to see if it comes together. It's difficult, but it comes kind of like where you cut was making that like I have so far. I don't know. I yesterday was very nice to see like everything visually. So every following along.
Good, good. Glad to hear it. Yeah. It's I don't know, I lost my train of thought. Sorry. It was something you said earlier and now I can't remember what it was. All right. So we'll get started here. There's a couple things that just from hearing you, I want to touch upon just real quick. So when it comes down to like the practice part, like learning how things function and everything, one really great way to maybe tackle a method that you're not like, why is this working the way it's working? How does this work? One way is to actually recreate it yourself, or at least try to recreate it yourself. So one of the things we'll do today is we're going to write map. We're going to create that function and all the functionality that is in it. So we'll do that early. I almost said this morning. My mind's still waking up. So we'll do that, and then we'll go over another iteration method. But it's an iteration method, but it doesn't always return the same result, and you'll see why. And then we'll jump into the Tiny FEF project. So, all right. So if everyone wants to go over to an about, just open a new tab, go to about blank, just like we did yesterday. We'll open up Scratch. Oh, great. Yes, please let them in. Let me make sure okay, good. I'm not muted. All right. So we'll start by. My screen is, we can see it, right?
I don't know if there was a slash on the video part. I don't know if that was.
Oh, I'm sharing the screen. I'm not starting like a video from my camera. At least I think that's what it is. This worked yesterday, so I'm assuming it's going to continue to work this way. I'm taking a big assumption here. Okay, so we're going to recreate array.map. That's what we're going to do. So before we can recreate it, first we have to know what it does. What are the requirements in order to use this function, right? So we're going to go quickly over to MDN. We're just going to type in array.prototype.map. And we'll talk a little bit about prototypes, just as a recap. Click on that. Before I touch on prototypes, does anyone want to try to just say what you think prototype means? What is a prototype in JavaScript? Does anyone have an idea? I'll keep it simple. There's prototypes can get pretty complex. So in some languages, there's something called classical inheritance, where you have a base class and other classes that you create can inherit from that class, meaning your base class is kind of like a blueprint. Let's just say you're creating a class that represents an animal. So you have this class animal, and it has different properties on it. Maybe it has the amount of legs, if it has how many heads it has, what color it might be, how old it can get, things like that. And it also has methods, right? So an animal, can it walk? Can it bark? What type of sounds does it make, right? Does it fly? How does it move around, right? So this class, which represents this animal, is pretty generic, right? When we say animal, it could mean any creature in the world, right? But maybe you want to be more specific about the animal. Maybe we're talking about a dog. So we would create a class called dog, and dog would inherit from animal because dog is an animal. So it would inherit those methods and properties that an animal might have, right? So it might have legs. The dog has legs. So we could say, well, legs equals 4, hopefully 4. And then, all those different things. So the way a dog communicates could be bark instead of, say, meow, right? So this is very specific class, but it inherits all the base properties from animal.
Is there any way you can make that bigger?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, we're just on an MDN right now. In fact, I'll just do this. I'll just post this in the Slack. Can I move this? So, yes, I can. Oh, that's so helpful. Okay.
Joey, do you know if there's a way to clear Scratch?
Clear Scratch.
New screen, 'cause it was when I pulled it up, it went to the code I was looking at tonight.
Oh, Control A, delete. And then hit run after you've deleted it. So when you hit run, it kind of saves it to memory.
I kind of rather not.
Not delete it. If you want, you can cut it and paste it into like a document. Yeah, because if you go to another tab and open up Scratch, it remembers where you left off. So you're going to see the same stuff. Yeah, it's just like as long as you have the browser open, it knows what you did last. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm going to post this. Excuse me. Link to the MDN reference here. So back to classes. So we have this base class, and anything of that type will inherit those base properties and methods. So a lot of languages work like that, like C# works like that. Almost anything with C in front of it. JavaScript is a C-like language. It's a C-based language, but it's not really. It doesn't do the same sort of thing. The original JavaScript was created, I think, in 11 days, 8 or 11 days. And so from there, it's had to evolve in a very special way based on how popular it got and all these different things. So the way JavaScript handles quote unquote inheritance is it has something called prototypes. So our base object, so if I were to say object, that is a native JavaScript type. It's an object, right? Just like string is a native JavaScript type. Number, Boolean. These are the base quote unquote classes. So by saying object.prototype, or actually let's do array.prototype, we're saying, okay, this whatever it's going to be, whether it's a property or a method, say a map, that is available to all arrays. So that's like the base, right? So every array has a method called map. And the way we access or can change that, which I don't recommend doing, if inadvertently you may, rewrite something, but that accesses the base map method available on every single array, right? We can also add new methods to via prototype, which we will do today, but we're not going to. I don't recommend doing this like in real production code. This is more of like a learning tool. So when I want to learn how something works on a native object or a native array or a string, I create a prototype on that base type just to learn how it works, right? I'm not going to use that in my production code because I don't want to overwrite someone else's prototype in some other language or framework that I might be using, right? So this is something that most people will vehemently tell you to avoid, but I say use it just for learning, right? That's my disclaimer, and that's on record. Okay. At least for anyone that watches YouTube. Streaming to the world, my disclaimer. All right, so today we're going to recreate not array.map. We're going to recreate array.prototype.map. And that's just to say that any array that we create after declaring this method will have that method, right? Now, if I were to say, let's say I define array.prototype.map after I've created something. Well, it came after the fact. That thing I created before doesn't have access to it. Top down, top to bottom type of processing in this thing. This is not an asynchronous sort of method of programming. This is very synchronous. Okay. Does everyone have a good grasp on synchronous versus asynchronous and what that means? No? Okay, so synchronous means literally it's like step by step. I'm going to do it in this order, bop, 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 right down the line, top to bottom. There's no, if something's taking a long time, the thing that comes after has to wait till that finishes. So synchronous programming is also considered blocking. right? You're blocking the next thing from happening because you have to return what you're doing in order for the next thing to happen. Whereas asynchronous is, okay, do this thing, and then when you're done, come back and let me know, right? It's like the difference between going to a coffee shop and saying, I want a cup of coffee, put the beans in there and then turn that on and fill up the water, and it's like, that's a synchronous way of doing things, right? Whereas if you go to a coffee shop and say, I'll have a large regular coffee with cream and sugar. Okay, we'll let you know when it's done. Right? That's an asynchronous action. And the way that you respond to the result of that is through those callback functions. So when that asynchronous action completes, your callback function will be fired, and hopefully you'll get a nice hot cup of coffee. Hopefully.
We don't only do one thing at one time.
No, it can do multiple things.
But it needs the input. That's why.
Right. So your processor can do lots of different things, right? I don't have a lot of computer science-y theory knowledge, but that's the
I guess that'd be
basics.
really a program, obviously.
Right. Yeah. So JavaScript is what's called single-threaded,
Right.
which means it only does one thing at a time.
Right.
But we can utilize other aspects of the JavaScript engine that's powering it, that's compiling it, to do multiple things, at least seemingly do multiple things at the same time. Right? And there's other ways to quote unquote do actual things at the same time. But you're still relying on the fact that you're working mostly in one single thread, and you do have to wait for those things to resolve. All right, so in order, and for anyone that came in after what I had said earlier, in order to, a really great way to learn how something works is to recreate it, right? And so by recreating array.prototype.map, we'll hopefully have a better understanding of what map is really doing under the hood, and you can apply this to any method, right? All we need to do is figure out our quote unquote requirements. So by going to MDN and looking up array.prototype.map, we can see our requirements. They're right here, right in front of us. The map method creates a new array with the results of calling a provided function on every element in the calling array. And then we have our syntax, so we know what it should look like when we call it. Right, there's our function signature right here. Here are the parameters that are passed into map. So the callback is a function that provides an element. It produces an element of the new array, taking 3 arguments, and it lists those out. And then the second argument to map is a this arg, which we'll touch upon the this keyword this week as well. I don't know, have you guys gone over this? You have? Okay. Does everyone have a good understanding of what that means? Basic understanding? Okay, good. We're in good shape. All right, and then we have a return value. So these are the things that need to happen. And then there's a description of all this stuff. Now I already know what map does and all the inner workings of it, because when I first really got map, this is what I did. I recreated it. And I've been using it ever since, and I love it. And any chance I get to use it, I use it because it's a great tool. I understand it, and I bend it to my will. All right, or at least try to. All right, so what do we have to do here? Well, what we're going to do first is we need to create a method on the base array. So we're going to say array.prototype. We're going to call it map2 because we don't want to overwrite map. That way we have, well, one, we're not doing something that's vehemently, that people are really against you doing, which is good. You know, it's a good community standard to uphold. But the other thing that we're doing is by not overwriting map, we can compare calling map with our map2 to make sure it's doing the exact same thing. We're getting the exact same results. So we can call it side by side by just adding another character at the end when we call it. Right? So array.prototype.map2 equals a function. And what does that function take? It takes, oops, what does it say? It takes, oh, that's the callback. The function, or I'm sorry, map function takes 2 arguments. it takes this callback function, and it takes this arg parameter as well. So the first thing we'll do is our callback, and then this arg. All right, so what do we know about map, right? We know that it produces a new array. So what's the first thing we should do? I'm just going to call it result. New array. There it is. And then at the very end, we'll end up returning that result. For most of the way there, believe it or not. Meaning that our map2 actually produces something, right? It's useful in the sense that you get something back. All right, so next, takes this callback, okay? But what is that callback? What's it for, right? So that function that produces an element of the new array, okay, and takes 3 arguments, that's great, but why do I need this callback? It's because this function gets called on every element of the array. So which is another way to say that every time this function gets called, the result of that needs to be plugged into our new array, right? Because every time you call back, you should be getting back the exact same length of your original array. So if I pass in an array that has 10 elements, I should get back an array with 10 elements, just transformed. Or hopefully transformed if we did it correctly.
Can you say that again? You said leave the function because it does what?
Because map is going to go through every single element and use that function to transform each value and plug those values into the new array coming back. Right? So if I pass in numbers 1 through 10, and my function multiplies by 2, I should have numbers from 2 to 20. Right? My math is okay. Math, who needs it? Right? I can just type it out. All right. So yes. All right. So we know that we need to iterate over every single element. And we don't want to use map to do it because that's cheating. So what are 2 methods that may come to mind that we could use? All right, we could use either, right? We could use either. Another thing that I'm going to lean towards for each for one reason, and that it shares the same type of pattern that map already shares, right? And this callback that we pass in gets passed 3 values. It gets passed the current value, so the current element being iterated over, and it also gets passed the index of where that element is in the array. Well, lo and behold, for each gets passed an element and an index. We already have it, right? We don't need to think about calculating it in any other way other than we're just going to use what for each provides us, right? And then it also has in this array, which was a reference to the original array that we're actually iterating over. Okay. Which doesn't really get used all that often. I don't really use that all that often. But if I'm recreating functionality, I want to make sure that I'm actually recreating all of it. I haven't really found any good real world examples of why I'd want to use that, but we'll put it in. So how do I get access to my original array? Close.
This array,
This, right? And the reason it's this, it's a terrible keyword. Right, this thing that you're calling map on, that's what we're calling it on. So that's the reference to the array that you're iterating over, right? Does that make sense? Hopefully it makes sense. All right. It didn't make sense to me at first, so. Maybe that was why I was like, I'm overthinking this. So sorry, I'm full of puns. It's terrible. Anyway, so we're thinking on here. So this dot for each, right? Because for each is available on every single array. This represents the array we're calling map on or map2 on. In that, we provide a function. We already know this. We know that it gets past the element and the index. So now we're iterating over the array. If we were to call this function now, let's just put some notes in here. Right, and now iterate or loop over the original array. If I were to hit run, and in my console, say var array equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Sure. Now I have this array. And if you notice, if I start typing, what's available now, right? Every single array after my declaration now has access to this function. So what happens if I call this? I get back an empty array, right? So because we iterated over it, but we didn't do anything, right? We also didn't provide it a callback function either, right? So it wouldn't have done anything really anyway. So let's just return our original array, or at least a copy of it, right? So we're creating this new array, and for each element in that array, we'll say result dot push the element. That's all we're going to do. So now if I call this, I get back a copy of that array. It's not the same array because we created a new one and populated it. There's array, and then there's the result. Does this make sense so far? But we don't want to just push the element in, right? What does this callback do? We pass in. It's a function that produces an element of the new array, okay, which means it processes it in some way, right? And right here, the current element being processed in the array. So anyone want to take a guess at what needs to go into this push here? In order to use our callback that we pass in. We have the index, we have the array. We need to process that element somehow.
Like do something with it.
You need an operation.
Yep.
Like element and something.
All close.
I don't think we'll follow you as well as we thought we would.
Okay. So what we need to do is this call. The reason we have this callback function is to process each element. So we use that callback, pass the element into it. Right? So down here, I would say, do I still have my variable r? I do. So now I'm going to say arr.map2. I'm going to pass in a function. This function is going to be passed an element. I'm just going to log the element. And for every single element of that array, my callback function was fired and passed each element. Does everyone see that? I wish I could toggle this out. toggle the output, but I can't get that out. Questions on this so far? Is the way I described it, does it make sense?
So when you say element, somewhere you've already typed in something that's producing the 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, or those are the indexes?
Those are the values. Let me change it from a number to something else that's more, it's different, right? We want it to be different than just that.
So you're putting an array of values that you return through the function.
Yeah, so what this map 2 is doing is it's taking the array that we're calling the map 2 function on, and for every element in here, we're going to pass that element into our callback function, which is this ends up being the element that's getting passed to us, and then we're going to do something with it. Ultimately, what we want to do is process that and return it back so it can be plugged into the new array that comes out. Right. Does that make a little more sense?
Yeah, it's PP, process S, process S.
I haven't heard that before. I don't know why, but I haven't. But yes, we're processing each one. Right now, we're not doing anything with them. And the reason you see undefined, undefined, undefined is because for each one of these, we're doing something. For each doesn't return anything. That's why we see undefined. We haven't returned any value. We're just pushing stuff into it. Well, actually, what's happening technically is that our callback doesn't return anything. Chrome wants to return something for us, and it wants to return undefined because we didn't define what we want to be returned.
And the reason we reference the values is because there might be some type of user interface where someone is entering the values that will get processed through this program.
Right. So let's say you're using TurboTax, and you fill out all the information. All those values get plugged into an array, and then all like the, let's say it needs to calculate the total amount of money you hopefully get back, right? Let's say they call map on this thing, and for each one of those values, it returns maybe a portion of that back. Yeah, I hope so too. So that would be their reason for using it. They want to process each one, get back everything in, sum it up, right? Hopefully a positive number and not a negative sign in front of it. Right, so we're filling out this array of values. They say, okay, great, I want the calculated results. They process it with map. They get back this new array, and then all they do is sum it all up. That would be a perfect example, high level. All right, so let's actually return something from our callback function so we can actually see our process, quote unquote, processed elements. So instead of just saying, let me clear this out. Instead of just saying console.log, let's return element.length. So we're passing in strings. Every string has a length. That's the amount of characters that are in it. So if I say return the element.length, I can see that my first string had 5 characters in it, my second 6, my third 5, right? I could do that. Or I could just return the element itself. That is no.
Cool, I did.
Lowercase e.
You can do element plus a string and it'll add a word. Or add. I just did that.
It will concatenate the previous,
Yeah,
yes.
very fun.
Yeah. And there's a function that does that for you.
Oh.
So if you want to know how that function works, you can recreate that one. You basically use the concatenation. That's so if you have an array of strings, you can use .join,
Oh,
and that'll put them all into one string. And then dot split will split them back out. Remember when I did that string dot split dot reverse dot join? That's essentially what those functions are doing. Okay, so we're going to invoke our callback function. We're going to pass in the element. Is that all we need to do? No, not exactly. There's 3 arguments to this callback function, so we have to implement the logic that goes into each of them. Right. So the second argument is the index. For each already gives us that, so we'll plug that in as the second argument to our callback. And just to finish out the callback, the third one is an array, which is the array map was called upon. So it's a reference to the original array. And I would just type this. Just this. We'll get to this arg at the end. Because it can get a little confusing. Hopefully it won't be. So if I run this, so right now I'm just returning element. I love how Chrome, this is new for Chrome in the past couple updates, where I forgot what it's called, but it tries to evaluate what you're doing as you're typing. So you can see the result before you even execute it. Even really, it's executing it behind the scenes before you hit enter. You can see right now it doesn't do anything. Right, so it's actually evaluating this thing, which is really nice. You can actually see your results as you're going along. So if I were to say, so my callback now takes an index as well. Maybe I want to return the index. Let's see, it's returning the index, which is not very useful. But maybe we wanted to do something like this. Some string concatenation. Right. So now we have access to each element. We have access to the index. We can process away. And we also have access to, I'm sorry. And then we also have access to our original array, which I'm just going to call original array. Maybe I want to return the original array each time. I don't know why I want to do that. Not very useful. It doesn't really do anything for us. But I should have seen an array, right? Should have seen an array. So let's figure out what's going on here. What if I pass this in? Nope, still doesn't like that. Is that just because Chrome's being weird? I'm not sure. That worked last night. We'll put it back this way. I should have gotten that. Push, callback. Callback, we pass in this. Function element, index, and original array. I'll investigate that. Oh. No. I'll look into that. The main thing I want to point out is that we're getting element and index, so we can process the same way we process map. So let's do that. Let's see if we've actually, if this is all that's needed to basically do the same thing. So we'll say array. We got our array dot map, the original map. Right? It gets an element, an index. We'll just do that, and we'll return element plus index. First 0, second 1, third 2. Cool. Hit up and just put a 2 in front of map. Did we get the same result? We just recreated map, the basic functionality, right?
Before you get rid of that,
Yep.
Because I know that disappears as soon as you're typing down there. Would it be possible to copy and paste that into the code and then comment it so that we have reference to what the result?
Oh no, I didn't want that. Oh my gosh. There we go. Is that better?
Yeah.
In fact, we'll just do this to line them up. I like things to be linear. It's a thing I got. All right. So we can see by calling .map and .map2, we get the same results. So we won't belabor this too much, but exercises like this are great for figuring out how things work. And you get a better understanding, hopefully get a better understanding of what's going on under the hood. So when every time you see map, you say, oh yeah, that goes through each thing, and I get past this, right? And then I know I'm getting back a new array of just processed elements, processed values. Super useful tool. It's a good technique to learn things. Yes, so let's do this. Let's do that right now. And I'll get back on this arg. That should worked. Oh, I put reacting. Can I edit that? React is ingrained in me. I type. It really is. Oh, good. I can. View details. Edit. Wow, what a process. There we go. Okay. Questions on this? Or this? I'll try. Smiles make me smile, so I'm glad you guys are smiling. All right. So am I good to clear this? Move on? All right, okay. All right, so I also said I wanted to talk about another iteration method, which is going to be very useful in the future as well, because you're going to see it often. And that is array. I'm just going to type it out because this is really what it is. Array.prototype.filter, or just array.filter is fine. And so filter iterates over every element in an array, and it returns the element if the condition you passed in is true regarding that element. All right, so if I just type var array equals 1, 2, 3, 4, 50, 100, 150. That's my array. We'll just do 1, 2, 3, and then 50, 100, 50. So we have 6 elements in this array, and I want to filter them out. So filter also returns a new array. That's the same thing as map, but it's a quote unquote filtered array. So we'll say var filtered array equals arr.filter. And filter also, we'll just go over here. So if you go to MDN and if you're already on map, you can see array.prototype.filters right on the left. So the filter method creates a new array with all elements that pass the test implemented by the provided function. Meaning you're going to pass in a callback function. If that function returns true, it keeps that element. If that function returns false, it discards it. Right? It doesn't put it into that new array. So let's see what that would look like. So we're going to have filtered array equals to our original array dot filter. We'll pass in a function. What does that function take? Let's take a look. Callback function takes an element, an index, and the original array. It seems familiar, right? Pattern, 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 pattern. Once you see the pattern, it's there. So it takes an element, index, and we won't worry about the original array.
If you were to click this,
You would type, I would do something like original array.
oh,
So it's just a reference to your original array. Yeah, if you type this there, that's a reserved word, and that won't actually work. Okay. So now we need to return true or false. But I need a condition, right? So I would say, let's say, return the element if it's greater than 49. If I hit run, I should have access to my filtered array. Those are the elements that pass the test. Right, so if I wanted the other elements, I could do something like return elements that are less than 49. Those are the elements that pass the test. Seems easy, right? It is. This is literally all a filter is used for, that I would ever use it for. As long as this condition is true regarding this element, keep it. Otherwise, don't put it in. And with all these array methods, well, most array methods like this, they're going to return a new array. They're not going to manipulate the original array. There are methods that do that. .splice will actually manipulate the original array. There's another method called .slice, which returns a new array of the elements that you want to take out of the original one. So it's really looking at the documentation for each one to figure out what it's doing. But filter will return a new array just like map. And it'll only keep the elements that you tell it that pass these tests that you pass in. So, but it is an iteration type of method because you're going through every single one of them.
Could you put in the return, could you put in if else?
Sure, you can have any logic you want in here,
Based on the return?
right? And so actually, Callie brought up a good point earlier. How do we abstract things, right? What if I don't want to keep typing all these things out, right? Let's say I'm using this function in 10 other places where I'm using filter. Well, I don't want to keep typing this thing out, right? Well, first of all, let's do this. Let's actually create this if else, right? So we're going to say if some condition else, do something else. I don't know why it's doing that. Probably because I didn't put anything in the parentheses. So if the element is, we'll do the same thing. If the element's greater than 49, oh no, that's not where I want to put it. Sorry, get my cursor in the right spot. Should look up when I'm typing more often. So if the element is greater than 49, I'm going to return true. Otherwise, return false. Let's run that, make sure we're actually, great, it's working. Good. Let's say we have a ton of arrays where we want to know every number that's more than 49. But we don't want to keep writing this function out over and over, right? So what can we do? We can abstract this function away. I'm going to cut it. And up here, I'm just going to paste it. And I'm going to give it a name. Greater than 49. Now we have this function that represents the logic behind the test that these elements need to pass. Are they greater than 49? Great, keep it. Otherwise, don't give me that. So how do I get this in here? I literally just do this. I have a bunch of arrays. Let's call it array 2. Literally just going to copy that. All right, in fact, just to make it more seamless, do one after the other. Now when I run this, I say filtered array. Oh, wait, sorry. Let's do this. Let me put a 2 behind it. Otherwise, we're just going to overwrite the array. All right, so here's my first filtered array. Here's my filtered array 2. So I abstracted away that functionality. Typically, what would be if you're only writing this function once and you're only going to use it once, there's no need to abstract it away. There really isn't. If you're going to use it twice, maybe. Use it 3 times, yeah. Now it's time to actually take that out, put it somewhere, and then call it when you need it. Right? For me, that's like the tipping point. If I need it twice, okay, I can deal with updating 2 pieces of code if I really had to. But if I have to update it 3 times, no, I'm not doing that. I don't got time for that, right? I've got other things to do. I've got products to create that are going to help people get their tax returns on time. That's great. That's good things, right? I don't want to have to. What if they make a change to the tax codes? Do I want to update 28 functions with that same logic? Nope, not me. The interns can do that. Just kidding. So what I would do is I abstract that function away, and then I can just call it when I need it, or just use it when I need it, right? If I need to make a change to it, I update it in one place only. I'm done, right? I'm gonna check in my Jira and go home. Does everyone know what Jira is? Heard of Jira? It's a ticket management software. So at work, we use it to manage the work that we're doing. So we'd open up a ticket and say, okay, well, here's some requirements. We need to meet these requirements. This code needs to do this. When we're done with that Jira, it passed through quality assurance, whatever task we're doing. Then we close the Jira out. We know we're done with that task. It's just task management. Yes. So let's do this. Let's say
You know what would be helpful? I don't even know if you can go back that far to see like a before and after of the code, because what I struggle with is.
Oh, how we got to this point?
Like when we do the absolutes, that's like the basic level, but how to translate that into the abstraction. So if you're dealing with
Gotcha.
multiple things.
Yeah, so let's do this. Let me copy this as it is. Oops, wrong one. Where was that here? There's the after. There we go. Before and after. After came before the before. Sorry. Saves me typing though. Saves us time. So does this make sense to everyone? Does it help with the abstraction?
It did, thank you.
Okay.
And it helps to see the pattern.
Yes. Yes. You see this. You still see these patterns a lot. Once you see it, you know what to do. At least you have a great starting point. I've seen this before. This is the type of function signature I need to use. Let's use it. All right. So next, who wants to create a tiny front-end framework? Sweet. All right, so let's get into that. We're going to close out the, we'll close out about blank for now. I don't think we'll need it. Oh no, I didn't. Oh, good, it's still here. Is everyone still connected to this? I was told it times out and I haven't been keeping up on it.
I wouldn't really connect it.
I sent another link just in case.
Okay.
Yeah, them words.
Oh, really?
Yeah, just being like stupid.
Okay, yeah, let's try to get,
They just kept saying it was like loading the whole time.
Yeah, I had that issue with the first one, and then
And the second one like didn't show up.
do you want me to paste it in there again?
Let me try one more time.
Says the session's still there.
Like, usually I can see here. Sometimes it's showing. This is the second one.
So who took some time to write down some of the functions that we might need in this? Did we do that?
You mean for this?
Right, so last night's homework.
So I don't know if there are functions.
I think it is, like,
I
my
sent
name's up
something
there.
up with something
Right.
on Slack,
Okay.
but-
I don't know, fine.
As long as you thought about it, that was all I asked. Just think about maybe some patterns that you need to use.
You know, so I have the logic of it, and so,
Yeah, wait,
you know, I have a better understanding of what
Alright.
document, object,
nope, I
model
can't see it.
And in order to, so my approach to this was to look at the HTML first and build my own down. So that way I could see what needed to be created and
Right.
then work on the code to create those different nodes.
That's a great approach. That's typically how I do things. Yep. I'm the type of person, I need to see something, and then I need to be able to make it, right? But I don't know what I'm making until I see it. Yeah. Even if I have to sketch it out on a piece of paper, right? I always have a whiteboard right next to my computer at work. I wireframe things out right on there.
And so I understand the logic, but still I'm struggling with syntax. And then also how to create those child
Yeah.
objects, because you have the div and then you have like divs inside of that.
Mhm.
div.
Yep. Yeah, so you would create the parent first, create the child, and then append the child to the parent. It's the opposite of human childbirth.
I think I did that with a lot of errors, but we'll see.
Find a parent, find a child, put the child in the parent. It doesn't know, it's the reverse. But computers don't care. We could do that all day long.
Where is this?
Oh, yeah, so this link is in Slack. It is posted it at 5:39. Oh, and Dave posted it a second time as well.
I didn't have the live.
Oh, did it work without the live tag?
Well, what's happening here is that we're able to sign in, and we have, should see the student class on those collaborative, but this might be a setting maybe on yours, so maybe hosting it, that you allow us to work.
Start.
So that's the part I don't know.
I don't have that tiny,
I can write.
I might need to.
Oh, it didn't. You have to click run. Got to click run up top.
I'm sorry, click.
Click run. And then you should see a link that says click here to see the final result. You click that. That is what the tiny company wants us to create. Yes. It exists of one person. He's only 3 feet tall. And he works at the North Pole. No?
Which document is this to read?
Oh, so what I did was I just hit run at the top. And what that's going to do is that is going to run the index. It's going to generate the index in the view. And right now, the only thing in index is a link to the homepage HTML that we need to recreate.
Gotcha. So we can follow along with the code that we have. We just can't follow along with the collaborative.
Okay. We'll have to make do. I don't want to spend too much time. Well, why don't we take, let's see what time is it? I guess I'll leave it up to everyone. Do we want to take the break now and have us try to figure this out rather than like say a half hour from now? Okay, let's do that. That way we can get more contributions going on. So I'm just going to pause this and we'll come back, let's say 7:05. All right, let's do that. Okay, so we're all on the REPL? Excellent. Okay, so just as we'll just have as a reminder as we go over this, let me do this. Let me open up the GitHub because it looks a lot nicer to look at the documentation through GitHub than it does through REPL because it doesn't do the formatting of the markdown file. And for those that want it open as well, I will post that in Slack. Cool. Tiny front-end framework for displaying user interfaces. Okay, so we're going to go through the technical requirements real quick. We know that the TinyFEF API should be a globally accessible object. So that means when if we're in our console and we type TinyFEF, we should see an object when we hit enter. Right? And then the properties that we want, the required ones, are create element, which is a function, and render, which is also a function. So create element, it looks like this this creates, still didn't update that, but this creates an element of the type passed to it. So it takes a type, and that's a string that represents the element to be created. It takes an options object that represents the attributes we'll be configuring on that element. It should default to an empty object. And children. So this is also optional, but if we pass in children, it can be either an element, a string, or an array of elements or strings. Right, so we'll start with just that. Let's actually just get something going there. And then render takes in an element and a target ID, and it basically plops that element as a child of that ID associated element. So the element that has the ID we're giving it is going to take the element we give it and append it as a child of that one. So in other words, if we look at the index file, there's already a div with an ID of app. So ideally, we would want our render method.
Can you blow that up so it's easier to see?
Does this help?
Okay, yeah.
Okay, I don't want to run her out of too much room, but hopefully it's big enough. Okay. Okay, good. So when we call render and we pass it an element and say we pass it the string app, it should take our element and append it as a child of this div. That's what render should do. And if we look at index.js, this is the script that the Tiny company gave us. They want us to run this script, and we need to create that TinyFEF globally accessible object so that when this script runs, we see this stuff. That's our goal.
Okay, see, I don't have. Oh, no,
So you got to hit run at the top. And then you should see this link. Yep. So every time you hit run, it re-renders index.html. That's the way the REPL's set up. Okay, great. So let's get into it. So we've got this tinyfef.js file. We'll take a look at that real quick. It looks like this is where they want us to. That is doubled. Why is that doubled? Let's get rid of that. Okay. So we need to configure this. Looks like they already gave us a globally accessible object. Have you guys seen this pattern yet? This immediately invoked function expression, probably in the modules lessons. So it means it's a function that as soon as the compiler comes across it, it immediately invokes it. And then what it returns is we're returning an object with one property right now. It's just this about property. So if I go over to the console and I type tinyfef, hit enter, I don't see anything. Why not?
So
Let it
how
run.
does one know that it's immediately invoked? Is it because it doesn't have any parentheses?
Oh, their console works a little bit differently.
Where it says.
Yeah, so
function.
let me write it this way. If I have a function, the only thing it does is console log something. This, just by declaring this and your code comes across it, it's not going to execute it, right? Because the way you execute a function, let's say I call this function, I have to give it a name. We'll just say log something, right? In order to invoke that function, I have to do log something, open close parens, right? That's how I invoke it. So by wrapping the entire thing in parentheses, I've now created an expression that will be evaluated. And it's going to say, oh, well, the result of that evaluation is a function. I immediately invoke that function, right? So within these two parentheses, I have a value. That value happens to be a function. And I'm just going to call it right away.
It's evaluating logs.
Yes.
So is it because you made it a variable, or is it because you added the parentheses at the end before the semicolon? The very end?
Oh, the way it's not rendering here? No, actually what this is doing is it's saying, create this variable, call it tinyFEF,
Yeah.
and it should be globally accessible.
Its value is that function.
Yes.
Yeah.
Its value is the result of this function being invoked.
Right.
Right.
But I'm saying like the thing that makes it immediately involved, is it?
Oh,
It's the variable, or is it because that?
it's because of what I just highlighted.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. That's what I wanted to know.
Yep.
For sure. Okay.
So
It's what you just highlighted. I thought you were saying that it was because you put a word after the word function.
no, what that's doing is in the first set of parentheses, I have this function declaration. So by putting it in parentheses, JavaScript is going to evaluate it as an expression. And that expression will always return a value. And that value happens to be this function that can be invoked. And then I'm immediately throwing parentheses after it to call it. What we could do also, let's do it this way.
Why does it matter if it's immediately?
I wanted to reintroduce the module type stuff that you had gone over. But let's, for simplicity's sake, let's do this. Let's just say var tinyFEF. It's just this object. All it is. Oops. That's more spaces. So tinyFEF is an object with one property on it. About. If I run that, and I type tinyFEF, it still doesn't like that. Interesting. Probably because it's running off of here. I'm going to keep open tab. And I'm just going to keep pasting in the work that we do so we can like watch it run. So we can validate what we're doing. Move this to here. I'm going to take the contents of tinyFEF. And, oh, I just realized why. I don't need the about. So what this is doing when I run is it's rendering my HTML document. And I didn't include the tinyFEF.js file in this document. Therefore, it will never run. That's what's going on here. I just realized it. My bad. So let's plug it in. Script. All right. My source is going to equal. Who wants to fill that in? Maybe we'll go around the room. So, Takir, you're up. Or Eva, you want to fill in, what should we put inside the source?
tinyFEF. Yeah, J.
Yep. Is it updating for you? Oh. All right, so let's run that. L is not a function. This is progress. This is a different type of message in the console. Something happened, right? So whenever you see an error and you're working on a problem and you keep seeing that error, the next time you work on it and you see a different error, you're one step closer because now you don't have the old thing to worry about. Now you got something new to work on. If I type tinyFEF, hey, there we go. We see an object with an about property and a version number. Great. So now we have this globally accessible object called tinyFEF. So what is this other stuff? Why does it say L is not a function? Let's take a look at that. Let's look at our index.js. We're saying var L equals a reference to the tinyFEF.createElement method. We haven't created that yet. That's why it's saying that's not a function, right? Because right after here, we're calling it to generate some content. So we got to create that function. So that's the first thing we'll take care of. We'll say create element is a new property function. And we put a comma because it's another property on an object. Key value pairs and objects are separated by commas. So it's just one little thing to watch out when you're, like, say you create a giant object. Make sure you separate the key values with commas. That's bitten a lot of people. So create element is this function. What does this function take? It takes in a type, options, and children. So let's put type, options, children. And we know the second two are optional. Okay, but it does say, even though the options is optional, there is a default to an empty object. So there's a default to it. So we need to create a default value for options. Who wants to try that? The requirements say that options should have a default value of an empty object. You want to take a guess how we give options a default value? So if I were to call create element, if I only pass it a type, options is already set to a default value of an empty object. I don't have to pass it. But it did say in the requirements that, yes, almost there. Is that, are you good? Okay, you're almost there. So what you're saying is if I pass in options, what happens next? If I actually pass it an object with some properties, what would happen on line 6?
Oh, it would.
You completely wiped out my stuff, right? So this is the old way of doing default values. There is a new way, but we're going to tackle this one first. Options equals itself or an empty object if it's not there. So that's how you would create a default value, right? So whenever you have two expressions on either side of an or operator, you guys went over and or, right? Those are considered expressions. Both of those will evaluate, so it can do the logic. On the right-hand side, we see there's an object that's considered a truthy value. It's true, there's something there, that's great. Options, if I don't pass it in, is undefined, which means that's falsy. So true wins in this case. Also, if I were to pass in an options object, options would win because when it evaluates that logic, it takes the first truthy value it comes across, right? So if we pass in options, it's our stuff. If we don't pass in options, it's this empty thing. So that's a default value. So we'll say create default value for options. Okay, great. Next we have Children doesn't say that it has a default value. Does it say element should render? No, it doesn't say there's a default, so we won't worry about that right now. We'll have to come up with some other logic to handle whether or not we pass in children. Excuse me, sip. All right, so let's tackle the type. We need to create a string that represents the element to be created. Cool, so let's create an element of a type passed in. Who wants to try this one? I'll get it started. Who remembers how to create an element in the DOM? Who wants to start typing it? It's a race. You win. You went? Just need to go to the end of the line. Oh, that's some weird behavior. Oh.
I'll stop.
Create element. Yep. Almost. We're creating a variable element. What type of element do we want to create?
Has to be a string, right?
The type we pass in, type represents a string of the element type. Almost. I'll finish it real quick. Type. We passed it in, right? So we pass the first argument to create element. The first parameter in create element is the type. So if I were to say create element, pass in a string of div, this is going to say var element equals document.create element div. Cool. So now we have an element. What do we need to do with this element? So we're asking create element to give us the type that we passed in. So we need to return it, right? It's not rendering it. We have a render function for that. All we need to do is create the element. So if this function never returned it, it would create the element and that'll be it. I don't know where it goes. It's there. It's in memory, right? So we're going to return it. So when we call the function, we say, hey, can you create this div for me? Yes, here we go. Here you go. Here's the div. And your options, you didn't pass any in right now. So you get an empty object. I didn't do anything with that yet. But what if I did pass options in? I probably want to use that to create attributes, right? So an object that represents the attributes that will be configured on the element. Cool. So if I pass in, if I were to call this thing, pass in, let's say, a div and options of like style, width 100. How do I, well, actually, let me put one more in. Let's say instead of just style, we'll do an ID, and that will be my div, right? So I'm passing in an options object that has two properties on it. How do I find out, there's a two key value pairs, how would I go through those keys to do something with them? Anyone remember? Yes. How do we iterate over the keys in an object? Can you type it out?
Yeah, but well, maybe not. But
Well, let's get it started for us. So here, I'm going to do this. I'm going to say,
It's really fun.
iterate over keys of options object and create attributes. So we'll just maybe start the syntax for us.
Now I don't remember. We made it in a variable.
Oh, yeah, after that, we called array of keys. And then we did that for. Yeah.
Got it. So object.keys.
I feel like
Right, so the result of calling this will give us an array of keys. So now that we have this array of keys, what do we want to do with them? We want to iterate over them, right? We need to set attributes on something else, not return the array. For each one of these, that's okay. It's just it's a meant. No, that's not what I meant. Not what I meant. What I meant was, it's you just have to get used to it, right? So this takes a function, and for every element in that function will be called. So it'll be passed what? The element and the index. I'm just putting EL instead of element because we did already define that. Maybe we'll just do like element, just so it's a different name because we don't want to get them confused. So if I reference element inside here, it's actually going to pull out this instead. We'll just do ELT, element. All right. So for each one of these elements, we need to basically set the attribute on this other element, right? So we could say element dot, what do we do next? Attribute. And what's the attribute we're setting? Actually, let's do this. We're iterating over keys, right? So we'll get past a key. Now we don't have to call element on element and make it all weird. So we want to, the element dot set attribute. What's the attribute we want to set? So if we look over here, style. But I don't say style, right? Because I have an array of strings that represent the names of these things. So I want to set attribute key. That's going to hold that value of, say, style or ID or whatever that property is. And the second argument is what? The value. How do I get at the value of this? How does anyone think how we could do that? No. So the object I pass in, if I wanted, let's say I had this object here, right? This is our options object. How would I get at the value for style? What would I say? Options what? What would I put in here? The key name. So if I say options style, it's going to return me the value of what that key represents. That is the same way of saying dot style. But if I don't know, I can't use dot notation if I don't know the value. I have to use bracket notation and evaluate what that thing is. So what I would do is I would say options at property key. That gets me the value. That's the same way as saying options dot style, options dot ID. Okay. So I'm gonna, so for each one of these things, I'm gonna element dot set attribute this key with that value. Cool. And then I'm gonna return the element. If I run this. Okay, we're not quite there yet. Looks like we still see this. So we've created this create element. What if let me see how their console reacts to this. So if I say tiny, well, first of all, let me say tiny FEF. Tiny, yeah. Why isn't this working? Did we lose our reference? No, there it is. Oh, there's an extra character there. Okay, that's probably there. Oh, tiny, yeah. Nope. Oh, we have another typo somewhere. Oh, we're missing the comma. See, I told you those commas will bite you, or lack thereof. Cool. So we have this object with a create element and an about. That's okay. I do it all the time. So if I say div, okay, so that doesn't really do much for me. I don't know if it's going to display that, or if how much logic I have in their console to work with, but that's okay. Div var div equals this. If I say div, all right. So their console is not as great as. Let's do this. Let me open up that about tab again, or about blank tab. And then in Scratch, I'll post in what we've got so far. So it looks like we will be utilizing this. Now if I say tiny FEF, that create element, div. Cool, I get a div. Let's pass in some options, ID of my div. Cool. Now let's see if we've iterated over it properly. All right, so we're doing that properly.
So on mine, sorry. I think you ran your code and then I hit run and it doesn't work. But I didn't do anything. Did anybody else have that?
We did.
You're getting this,
Oh,
right?
Yeah.
Yep, you're actually, that's okay.
okay.
We haven't
got the
actually
green
finished the implementation yet, so it's not gonna do much. Their console isn't as great as Chrome, so I'll just keep pasting in our progress here,
Okay.
and we'll keep evaluating it that way.
So the options
Yes.
is like everything we want that div to have.
Yes.
Just and then array.
In an object form, and we're gonna iterate over all the keys and pull the values out that those keys associate with, or those values associated with those keys. Yep, you got it exactly though. All right, cool. Okay, we're almost there. What else do we need to do? Children. All right. Well, let's take a look at the code they've provided that needs to get evaluated. So it looks like, well, everywhere you see L, think of create element, right? That saves a lot of typing. It's a great practice. So div style, cool, comma. So this entire thing is going to be a child of this div, whatever comes after that, right? So we have to handle children because they want us to. It's a requirement because there's a reason. And it looks like everything's separated out by commas. So that means there's multiple arguments. So if they pass us a single argument, we don't necessarily need to iterate over that. We just kind of use it. If they pass us a string, according to the documentation, we need to create a text node. That's okay. But we also can get past an array of stuff. So how do we know if what we've been passed is a single argument or many arguments that are there, right? It can, according to the documentation, if we look a little closer, for children, it says an element string or array of elements, we've got that. If passing an array, only the elements of that array will be rendered, okay? And all subsequent elements will be ignored. So if we actually pass in an array, that can be the only child argument, okay? Otherwise, these children are appended in the order that they're given. So that implies that if I don't pass an array and I just keep passing more and more arguments, I'm going to need to use all of those as children. So you'll see documentation like this. And the reason I left it like this is because this is how you'll see things in API documentation. It's like, oh, this, and this. What this is really saying is, if you pass an array, just use that. Otherwise, everything you give it, you have to use all of it, right? You got to figure it out somehow. So it would be really useful if no matter what gets passed to it, we always treat it like an array, because we can always iterate over an array, right? If there's one element or many elements, it doesn't matter. So thankfully, there's a way to do that. It's going to look really weird at first, but it's going to look a lot nicer later on. I'm just going to say it that way. All right. So how do we get everything that's passed after the second argument? So the third argument and on into infinity, we have to transform all that stuff into just one array. So we have one logic, iterate over the children array. That's what we want to get to. Does that sound like it makes sense? Not that it makes sense, but that's to get the gist of what we need to do.
You just need to prepare for the possibility of having more than one child.
Correct. We need a base case. Our base case is, I'm sorry?
Very responsible.
Yes. We're good stewards of our users. All right, so no matter what, we only want to do one thing, iterate over an array. That's it. We don't want to, whatever else you pass us or whatever you try to do, we don't care. We're only going to do this. We're going to keep it simple. So whatever you give us, exactly. Yes, basically. And you should love all your children the same, right? You may not like them all the same, but you should at least love them all the same. All right. You're really my favorite. No, you're really my favorite. I would never say that. At least not to their face. Okay. So children. So now we need to make sure that all arguments after options are placed into an array to iterate over. Right? So let's do that. So there's a special keyword for looking at the arguments of a function, and it's called arguments. Literally arguments. But arguments is not an array, but it's array-like. It's kind of like you can iterate over it, but it's not a real JavaScript like array as we think of arrays. It's a special type. So we can't exactly treat it like an array. There's no methods that arrays have, even though it has indexes. Like I could say arguments at index 2 would give me the third argument passed in, but then I'd have to keep going. Well, then argument 3 and argument 4, that doesn't sound like a lot of fun, right? Because we don't know how many arguments a user would pass. All we know is that there are arguments there. I mentioned a method earlier that's available to all arrays, actual JavaScript array, not this special type of arguments. That's called slice. So what slice does is it creates a new array of the stuff you want to pull out of another one. So if I had 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, I said slice 0, it would say, okay, this array here, starting from index 0, give me everything from then on. I want all of that. If I said slice at index 2 and say, okay, starting at index 2 and on into however long it is, give me all of that, right? But that's only available on an array, not on arguments. But there's a way to get around that. If I say empty array has this method. That's cool. We're not quite there yet, though. I want to slice 2 out of that, or from 2 on. But I need to know how do I get arguments in array to match up? There's a method on, every method has other methods. Like every function has other methods. Yeah, there's functions on your functions. Didn't you know that? But there is. And there's a special reason for that. So all functions are objects. Objects can have properties and methods. So a function is just an object that you can call, but it can have properties. And it has one called call. So it's going to take this method and call it. And the first argument to this method is a reference to this inside that function. Sounds a little weird, but if I were to say, I'm going to take an array, I'm going to slice it, but when I call slice, I want arguments to be the thing I'm actually calling slice on. And then the parameter after that is what I would normally give to slice. So it's saying, okay, whatever you're doing with slice, whenever the internals of slice are saying this dot, put arguments there. So arguments at index 2 and on. Now I have every single argument from index 2 and on. Those are all the arguments. So what I would do here,
You're saying it wouldn't work if you didn't say dot call?
if I just say dot call,
No, I mean, if you said.
oh, dot slice,
Dot slice.
it would call it on this empty thing. Yeah. Right, so I'm just going to check one thing. Make sure that I'm on track. Okay.
Since we're talking about iteration, don't we usually put something in there like as long as it's greater than 0, or so that it can move? So that it can
Oh, I see what you're saying. So if it's there, actually call this thing.
So let's say, so from what I'm gathering from this is that you're calling in different elements, like maybe P or div or something.
Oh, right. So whatever I pass after options,
So,
we need to know if they're there if we want to do this.
yeah, I'm just saying that if it's going back to the array, we just want to pass something as long as the array is just not empty.
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So slice is one of those special things where if you give it an index, let's say you pass in an array of only 2 things, and you say starting at index 10, do this stuff. It's not going to.
So
Yeah.
So my question is, does it have to have an index, or can you just refer? Can we just reference it? Is that where this is leading? Because I do see that right now you're calling for a specific index.
Yes.
So what I'm asking is, at some point, do we just reference what?
In this case, we want to start at that index because we know that in this function, these 3 arguments are in that special arguments array type thing. Index 0 is this. Index 1 is this. Starting at index 2, we have our children. So we actually want to know that, right? If you didn't pass an argument, this would return every single element. It's the same as saying slice 0. If you give it none, it assumes 0.
So children is already referencing something, and here you're just saying slice, whatever.
Right.
Whatever is that index 2, which is.
Yes.
That create element right above it.
right? All this snippet doesn't do anything for us yet. I'm only showing you how to turn arguments into a workable array, right? But what if children already was an array? We'd want to know that ahead of time so we don't just grab all this stuff, right? It's already done for us. Why do we need to do that? Right. So I'm just going to type this out and then we'll explain it. I say children equals how we had that like default type behavior before, options equals options or something else. So we're going to say children equals have you gone over ternary expressions yet? It's a ternary expression.
Oh,
Yeah.
You have? Yeah, so this question mark this, otherwise that. Yeah, so it's the same way of doing like a really quick if then or if then. Let's take a look at this. We'll talk about it. So children, same way we're saying options equals options, or if options wasn't passed, we get this thing. Children equals, if this condition's true, children equals children. It's the same thing. Array dot is array is a way to tell if something is an actual array. There's another way to get a type of something to see what kind of type it is, and that would be saying type of. If I were to say type of options, that would return me a string value of the type. It would return me something that says object. If I were to type of children, that would also return me a type of object. But it's an array, right? But an array is a special type of object, just like a function is a special type of object, right? So, but there is a method to tell if it's an actual array or just an object, and that is the prototype method on array, the actual base itself, call it isArray, and you pass it the thing you want to evaluate. If it comes back true, it's an array. Cool, we can keep going. If it's not, we're going to grab all the arguments and plop them into an array. So that's what this line is doing here. So children, no matter what, will always be an array from here on out, regardless. If you pass me an array, cool. If you don't, all of this stuff. And now in the requirements, it said, if you pass an array, ignore everything else. Right? So if this condition is true, use the third argument. That's an array. Otherwise, grab every single argument from the third one on. Right? So this is solving two things. It's solving one, we're always going to have an array. And it solves the other one, which is if you pass an array, that's the only thing you'll be using. And so it solves both.
Like it wouldn't put the children array into another array. So like
Right. It'll be either itself or the comma separated arguments. Right. So it could be an element, a string, an element, a string, an element, a string, or it could just be this array of stuff. Why is that necessary? When we start looking a little bit closer at the script they want us to run, we'll see why. All right. So at one point they are giving us an array, and every other point they're not. They're just passing a bunch of stuff that need to be children of other parents and stuff like that. Okay, so how are we doing on time? Doing pretty good. Okay, so now we've got these children. That's cool. What do we do with them? Well, if we pass children, they need to be the children of the element we're creating, right? So, make sure I'm on track. Yes, we need to do that. So now that we have an array of children, what can we do with it? Now that we have it, for each, it's for each over it. function. All right. What's that?
I thought we could just put the children into the object, directly. We have to move over them.
Well, all we have right now is an array of children. We have to do something with them. So we have to iterate over each one and decide what we want to do with each one of them. Right? So what we're going to do is we need to append them to the parent, right? All right. Right, but there's a requirement around appending those things. Right? So it says, right, let's see. Elements, so if I pass another element, we should append it. But if I pass a string, I should create a text node.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So we want to know if what we're getting is an element or a string. Now there's a few ways to do this. We're going to keep it really simple. We're going to be very generic about what we determine to be an element, what we do not, what's a string and what's an element. But we're only expecting two different types, right? We're not going to go into all the details. It would take forever to do all these different calculations, right? So we need to know, first of all, we need to pass it. So we need to pass the child and an index. We're not really using the index. We don't really care. All we care that is there's a child that we're iterating over each child. So the first thing we need to know is if the type of the child is equal to, what do we want to start with? String or an element? Element. So an element, according to JavaScript, is a type of object. So if it's an object, we'll do one thing. Check if element / object else. Oh, someone already started doing it. Great. Nope. There's only two cases, right? If it's this, otherwise it's that. So if type of child equals object, what do we want to do with it? And append it to our element, right? So if it's an element, we want to say element. And how do we get that as a child? Append child. And what do we append? Child. Otherwise, what do we do? Who wants to fill this one out? Who wants to try to fill this one out? So you're on the right track. I'm going to retype that for you real quick. What do we pass in? A string, but string is represented by the child we're iterating over? Right? Because that's the thing we're currently iterating over, right? If it's not an element, it's a string, so we're going to treat it like one. But all we did was create a text node.
Oh, so
We have to append that somehow. It's a node, so it can be appended.
oh,
The same
so
child
we're
in a
saying,
parentheses doesn't
so we're saying element again. Append child. Oh,
The way this will work is this will evaluate first. It's going to give us a node. And now that it's a node, this one will fire. It'll append it.
so it evaluates from the innermost.
Yeah, we could also say something like this. We could say var text node equals this. This will probably make it a little clearer, right? And then we append the text node. You can place all this logic right in here, and just like the order of operations, it'll do it that way. I'm gonna hit run just to, it's auto saving, but it makes me feel better. That it's saved because I ran something. I do it all the time. Like Google Docs. Google Docs, I do it. Microsoft Teams does the same thing. Yeah. All right. So we've appended this stuff. Let's take this, paste over our previous endeavors. Okay, so we've got this thing, right? What if we pass in string, hello, and another string, world? Oh, create text node. Yeah, so we can't just call create text node, can we? What is create text node a method on? Document. Ah. If I expand this, there we go. So now I have a div of an ID of my div, a style of color blue. So would this render a color on the screen? What would be blue here? Pop quiz CSS. The text. So this element, all of its children, their color's blue, unless otherwise overridden by the child. So if I were to say background color, then it would be the div. All right. That was my first pop quiz. That's great. There will be more. Now that I remember I was going to do it. Sorry. Spoiler. All right. So this is great. We have a working according to the documentation. But do we? Let's find out. So if I were to have an array of stuff and then something else after it, if I expand this, what's going to happen? Only the stuff in the array. That's cool. What about elements? Let's do a paragraph. We'll say element.innerText equals I am a p tag. Right, so if I say L, I should see, whoa. What happened? Oh, I gotta do that over. No, that's weird. DevTools disconnected. I don't like what's going on here. Let's say var p equals document.create element of type p. e.inner text equals. Whoa, hey, apparently I typed that at one point. Okay, it doesn't like that. I don't know why. Yeah, let's close out that tab. Something happened. The wonderful thing about Scratch.js, it's still here. And the FEF is still there. Cool. Probably because I did all this stuff before. But create element. P. Okay, there we go. Text equals. We'll do woe again. We won't do woe again. We just won't look at it. We'll just say tinyfef.create. I still have that in here. No, it blew up. I blew up something. Okay. I don't know why it's failing on creating a p tag. So let's create something else. Nope, tab is broken. All right, strange behavior from Chrome. Call it div4. I haven't defined that anywhere. Create element div. We'll say div4 is a div. Div4 dot id equals please work. Hey. All right. So if I were to say,
Gotta use magic words. Gotta use the magic words.
all right, so what we're passing is this stuff. And one of them is going to be div4. Div4, we'll say hello again. All right, it's working. We implemented this. Fantastic. All right, well, we just implemented the create part, right? So if I run this, I still see this stuff over here, right? What? This is a new error. We don't see L is not a function anymore. What do we see? All right. Now we need to render. Yes. Sorry, this doesn't exist. Oh, I should probably create that. Okay, so next step, now that we have a create element function, let's create a render function. Comma. So what does render take?
Element and what does that say?
Target ID. All right, so that's where there's an element on the page somewhere with that ID. We should probably append this element to that as a child. That's basically what it's saying. So it takes an element and a target ID. We know the ID already of this thing we want to append to. So how would we append an element to the other element? How would we append as a child this element to the element with this ID? So you start typing it. Oh, can anyone still? You guys are still connected, right? CG Quay.
There you are.
There we go. Ruppel was like, just kidding. Okay, now you can go. All right. Oh, I guess just start typing. Yeah. You're close. Very close. Whoops. Can you hit undo?
No, I had it clean twice on mine. That's why I did that.
We lost the rest. We lost
I
the
don't
rest
know
of it.
what's happening now.
Can you hit just Command Z a few times?
Nothing happens when I hit the
Oh, they did not implement Command Z. That's fantastic. All right, so let's do this. We have this. Actually, all the way down to here. So after render, we have this. I'm going to paste this. Okay. Oops. What happened? All right, let's make sure that doesn't. Okay, so render fired. Cannot read property append child of undefined. So what we're saying here is document.target ID. We're looking for the property of document of whatever this is, of target ID. The document doesn't have a target ID. So what we need to do is find the element first that has this ID. We'll use that. So you're almost there. What we'll do is we'll say target dot, or I'm sorry, document dot, we'll say query selector. So that's going to give us an element. What's the query selector?
Target ID.
Target ID. Is that going to work? Let's find out.
Do you have to do get element?
No. Yes. If element by ID, the target ID we pass in.
Oh, query select.
I don't see any errors. What if I go to result? Oh, look what we created. A lot of them. Hold on a second. So remember that behavior where you keep like appending stuff?
Yeah.
Yeah, we're doing that. But look how many times we got it right. All right, so we've basically implemented this thing, except for one thing.
You couldn't let us have it.
Yeah. What if I click get started? It didn't do anything. So if I look at the home page reference, if I click get started, it redirects me somewhere. That was behavior. What if I type in, oops, run again. Click here to see final result. What if I go down to here, type in here to hit subscribe? I'll say probably an email, right? That's a terrible email address that you'll never remember. It displays an alert to saying this, right? So there's something else that we need to implement. Event handlers, yes. So where would the event handler possibly be? Where do we think it is? If we wanted to put an event handler without changing our function signature, if we create element, where would it go? So I pass in a type, I pass in options, and I pass in children. Where would I put the event handlers that I want applied to these elements?
Best in what? Type options.
Who said options?
You said all three, so.
Oh, so you were just like, all right, I'm just going to blast it out. One of them is going to be correct. I like that approach. It's very brute force, right? One of these will work. All right, yes. So just like an ID is an attribute that can be applied as an attribute, we can apply an event handler, although we apply it in a different way. It's not an attribute. It's actually, well, it's an event handler, but it's like, think of it like how TinyFEF create element is a method on that. It's kind of like that. So how do we access that? Well, let's first take a look at, let's take a look at the code they're feeding us, right? This is the script that needs to run. There's a button in here somewhere. Button, oh, here's a form. So there's an options object right here. It looks like it's a key value pair. The key is on submit. The value is the function for that event handler. So the on submit event has this function that fires. And there was also this get started. Where's get started? Right here. So there's a style on it and there's an on click. So it's a key value pair on this options object. Excuse me. So on click would be the key we're iterating over. But we can't say set attribute on click. Oops. So let's go back to our options. Okay, so somewhere in here, ooh, what happened there? Someone here, we need more logic, right? We need to know if what we're passing is an attribute or what we're passing is an event handler. So what is an event handler? Function. Event, yes. So that function will tell us what to do when that event happens. So what should we do when we're iterating over every single key? What do we want to look at for that value? It's a function, right? So check if attribute or event handling function. Still can't spell it. Handling function. We'll say event handler function. So if what? We want to check the type, right? If type of the value of that key, yes, equals what? What do we want to check for first? Well, it's only one or the other. Function. Check for a function first. Because we know that if it's not a function, it's probably an attribute, right? So that's our base there. So if it's a function, do something. Otherwise, do this. Right? Yes.
That type of isn't going to give back object.
No. It will tell you it's a function. It's a very special object, special enough that you need to know right away if it's a function or not, right? It's probably an afterthought with the array. Oh, we should probably tell people that that's actually an array and not just some special object. Who knows? Terrible decision making in the beginning. Remember, this was implemented in 11 days in the start. All the guy had was 11 days to meet the deadline. All right, so if it's, oops, where am I? Lost my spot here. Okay, so we already know how to handle an attribute. Anyone want to take a guess how we're going to apply an event handler? I'm sorry? Oh, it stopped streaming? Zoom?
You did.
Oh, I did.
Oh, wait.
Is it delayed? REPL's still in beta. So we'll have to deal with it. So what we can do, if I wanted to put in an on-click handler, I could say element.onClick equals whatever function this is, right? But I don't know what the name of this key is, right? So instead of saying element dot, bracket notation, and what do I put in here? No. Key equals the word. How do we get that value again? That's the value. So element at property called key equals the value at options that key. So let's try that again. Let's run this. Over and over. Hey. Next one. All right.
Now.com.
And I got started. Anyone notice anything weird about what the home page did? If I go to the home page, their reference went somewhere else. That's actually my fault. So what happened is when I pasted this code in, I decided later that I wanted to redirect somewhere else, and I forgot to come back here and update the event handler. So that's my bad. But it's working. We've implemented tinyFEF, and we even handled the array situation. So if you notice here, var homepage data, that actually represents each one of these. You can see there's an adjective called simple, a description. There's an adjective called declarative, one called tiny. It knew that since that was an array, treat it like one. Otherwise, just do the rest of the stuff. So when we look at this, there's really not a lot to it, right? There's two functions, one called create element. It's just some very, very basic logic. Hey, what are you passing me? I'll create that element. Did you give me any options? Cool. I'll iterate over them and apply them based on the type. Did you pass me children? Great. I'm going to append them as a child. That's all it's doing. Wow. Was that a locomotive? All right. So render. This is all it does. Right? It takes the element you give it and it appends it to the other element of that ID. Very tiny. It's a very tiny front-end framework, very appropriately named. And for working on this front-end framework that you implemented it, you now get to work remotely from any beach anywhere you want in the world with full benefits. So congratulations. You made it. You did it. You didn't even have to get an internship to do it. All right, so questions on what we've covered so far? Start there.
The element square key and the option square key, I can't.
Which line?
All of that. Every time she used it.
14.
Oh, element?
Yeah.
Element square bracket key. I can't understand what that.
When you're talking about the key value versus
Oh,
the
okay. So I'll address both of those specific questions. So let's pretend that the key is ID. That's what it's doing. It's doing this. Saying element brackets ID is the same thing as saying this. It's two ways to access a value or assign a value. The difference between them is that if I say .id, that is the exact spelling of that key, of that property, right? Element.id, that is the actual name of that attribute property, of that property name.
Is that specific?
It's that specific. There's no room for error. That's the one. That's like when we tried to say we spelled something wrong somewhere, and it didn't find it because we spelled it wrong, right? So whereas this will take whatever's in these brackets, evaluate it, and use that after the dot, right? So in here, it could be ID dash or data dash ID. You can't type dot data dash ID because what it's going to do is it's going to say, oh, okay, say take element dot data and subtract ID. It's not a valid syntax. So the way to get around that is to evaluate that thing and use that as the property that you want to access. That's what's going. Does that help?
Yeah, so key is from the option. And option is just,
The options is the object we pass in.
and it's all.
Each property is a key value pair.
and that
Key represents the left side of that. ID, on click, style.
And those are types of elements that we're going to know.
No, the key is just a string, right? It's a string that represents the property name, right? If I say options.id, ID is the key. But if I say options.id, that syntax results in giving me back the value of property ID, right? if I say options.id, I expect to get something back than the word ID, right? I would get back my div or something like that, right? Does that help?
Yeah, online it's like a regular object key.
Hmm?
Like a regular key that's in an object, right? So
Yep.
So like, it's like the exercise we do with albums, like, right? So then I have to be here, like, title, whatever, the key would be title, year, and then the value
Exactly.
would be like 2004.
That's exactly it.
Okay.
Yep. Key is another way of saying property.
Yeah.
Right.
Using key is to object as indexes, right?
Yes.
That's kind of hard.
Yes. And
That helps me
AT
too.
question.
in fact, you're more. That's even more correct, right? So an option at this named index, that's the key, right? Very good. Very good. And then, did that address your question too? Okay, perfect. I wanted to make sure that those were all answered. We have a few minutes left. Thoughts on this? How do we feel about this? Was this helpful?
It was easier than I thought it was gonna be.
Yeah.
Less intimidating, not easier.
Less intimidating. We broke it down little by little by little.
Yeah.
Right? When you address the problems that way. Right. We took each part of that requirement and we're just trying to go down the line of those requirements and try to fulfill each and every one of them as we go. Right?
It was a really real world example. Like I could envision this would be something we would get asked to do on the job. And
Right.
it's kind of nice to get to see like, oh, this is what we're getting into.
Right.
Right. This is a very simple implementation
Sure.
of a lot more complex stuff, right? Like, so if there was an opening at Facebook on the React core team, you'd be doing stuff like this just at a different level, right? But when it all comes down to it, the tiny little pieces are lots of this, right? It's just abstracted away in a nice, compact, elegant, or maybe not so elegant, maybe it's hidden away, right? There's more complex ways of doing these things. We're just doing it it's an oversimplification, right? But it did create elements in the DOM, right? It actually functions, right? It's a functioning thing. It's not just like this. You could actually take this and start building upon it and making your own little tiny front-end framework. You could actually do that. And that way you don't have to worry about downloading React or Angular or Vue or anything.
Okay, so can I take this then and then change some stuff and upload it to GitHub and be like, here's the tiny thing I made. And then I did it, it's me.
Yeah, if you want to. Sure. Take what you learn, expand upon it, give it more functionality, right? In fact, before I go into homework, we've got a few minutes left. Last thoughts, questions? Is there anything that's still confusing about what we've gone over today? Or does everyone feel really good about what we've gone over?
Yeah, I have to do it again.
Right, repetition, of
Yeah,
course.
do it every time.
And that's a perfect segue into homework. Homework is, see these optional features? That's your homework. Implement the optional features. Right, so what I'm going to do is, this REPL is saved, right? So everything we've done is there. And then all you need to do is, what is it? Settings? There's a way to fork this thing.
No, it's at the-
On mine, that says-
yeah, on ours at the top.
It does say fork it?
It says-
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Yeah. So fork this REPL and implement the options. And then when you've completed it, you'll just share your REPL link in the homework assignment. Make sense? Okay, cool. All right. And we're done for today. Tomorrow, just a little preview, we're going to talk about ES6, ES5, ES6. What the heck does even ES mean, right? We're going to talk about all that stuff and some different ways of or some new syntax available to us to make the way we write our code simpler and more concise. And slightly more powerful as well. All right, so I'm going to end the stream. And we're good there.